There's Hashem. Today's daf is Daf Yud Zayin. Today's learning, we're going to be learning the Zecha Nishmas, Mario's father, Harav Yehuda Yidel ben Yaakov Yitzchak, whose yard site is on the 19th of Shvat. Our learning should be his Chusvas Neshama in Gan Eden. Okay, so we are beginning all the way down on the bottom of the page of Daf Tes Zayin Amud Beis, about 6 lines from the bottom. Basically, we've discussed the Mishnah and the machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Our first understanding of the machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. What's the machlokes all about? If a person makes a Kabbalas Naziris, accepts upon himself to be a Nazir, and he's in a cemetery, so according to Rabbi Yochanan, it's a good Kabbalas Naziris. It's a good acceptance of Naziris. All you have to do is leave the cemetery, spend 7 days, and matar yourself, and then continue, start counting your Naziris. Reish Lakish says, no, you made a Naziris, you made an acceptance of Naziris while you're in a cemetery. That's not considered a good Kabbalas Naziris, and therefore the Naziris doesn't take effect. You have to reaffirm your commitment again after you're matar yourself from the cemetery, after you wait 7 days, have the spraying of the paraduma, then you tar, you have to reconfirm your commitment that you want to be a Nazir. Other than that, you're not a Nazir. So, Esvei, this is a question against Reish Lakish. It says like this, the Brisa says, Misha hoya tame, person was tame, the Nazir. Let's say he touched a dead body, and he made himself a Kabbalas Naziris. He says, I want to be a Nazir, but he's tame. Asale galeach, he's not allowed to take a haircut, velishtus yain, and drink wine, bilitame lemesim, and to touch a dead body. He should not touch a dead body again. V'im giluach, v'shas yain v'tim lemesim. If he did take a haircut and drank wine and was mitam lemesim, and this probably means, his mitam lemesim means after he became tahar. In other words, obviously, if he's tame already, how could you be mitami yourself to a mace again? It means like this, that right away he's also to take a haircut. Right away he's also to drink wine. However, after he becomes tar, he's not allowed to be metamela mesim, and if he does so, he gets malchus. So right away you see that his acceptance upon himself to be a nazir is valid, even though when he accepted upon himself to be a nazir, he was a tame. He was almost like standing in the base of kavaris. And he does not have to reconfirm his commitment that he wants to be a Nazir. So that's what the Gemara's question is. If you say, Bishlama, Chayla, that as soon as you accept upon yourself a Naziris, even though you're Tame Meis, and therefore it works, Hainu Tama, that's why the Seifik is Aboim. I understand why you get Malchus if you take a haircut, drink wine, because your commitment is a good commitment. It's a valid commitment. You're a Nazir. Eli Amrit loy chayla. But if you say like Reish Lakish that your commitment is not considered a valid commitment, and therefore it doesn't take effect, so then amai soifik is a boring. Why does the Brisa say you would get malchus? You're not even a nazir. You have to reconfirm your commitment. So guess what? So we go to Daf Yud Zayin Amud Aleph. Here, this Brisa is talking about biyoytze v'nichnas. You went out. You waited the 7 days. They purified you. They sprayed on you on the 3rd day and on the 7th day. And then you went to the mikveh. And the Brisa is talking about you actually re-accepted upon yourself Hareini Nazir. So what's the novelty of that? What's the novelty? Of course, if you accepted upon yourself, you reconfirmed yourself your commitment as a Nazir. What is the novelty of the Brisa? The Brisa is telling you that even if on day 1, let's say the 7th day, when you went to the mikveh, after you had the spraying of the paraduma, so that 7th day is counted as day 1 of your Naziris. And therefore, if you accepted upon yourself Naziris after you left the mikvah, if you are matame yourself to a maze, if you go back into the cemetery, then you have to bring a korban tuma, and you have to restart the count. And that is against the opinion of Rabbi Elazar, who we saw in the Mishnah, that says that the only time you have to bring a korban tuma is only if you're in the 2nd day of your Naziris. If you're in the second day of your Naziris, so that if you have to restart the count, you have to restart minus 2 days. Then you have to bring a carbon tuma. But on the first day of Naziris, if you metami yourself, you don't have to bring a carbon tuma. So we're trying to, Bryce is telling you, we exclude ourselves from that Tana. And even on the 7th day, when you went to the mikvah and you re-accepted upon yourself to be a Nazir, if you go back into the basic kvaris, you are you get malchus, or if you and you have to bring a carbon tuma. Okay. Another question. Again, if somebody is a Hame, when he accepted upon himself to be a Nazir, according to Reb Shlokish, that's not a good acceptance. You have to reconfirm your Naziris. So, Esvei, I'll ask a question. Ein bein Tame shenaza lenazir, ein bein Tame shenaza lenazir tar shenitma. There's no difference between a Tame. He's in a basic kvaris. He's in a cemetery. Shenazar, he made himself a Nazir. And compare that, there's no difference if you compare that, Lenozitar, person who was a regular Nazir, and Shenitma, he became Tame. What's the difference between the two? Ella, the difference is, there's only one difference. Tame Shenazir, if you're a Tame and you made yourself a Nazir, Shvi Shaloi Oiloi Minaminyan. On the 7th day, after they sprayed the sprinkling of the 7th day paradumad waters, and you went to the mikvah, that's really started your counting your day one. The Nazir Tar Shenitma, but a Nazir Tar, that somebody who was Tar and then became Tame, he also has to wait 7 days to start the process again. Again, when a Nazir Tar becomes Tame, he has to go back to the beginning and restart the count. So he can only restart the count on the 8th day, because on the 8th day he brings carbonis, and then he can restart the count. So you have to wait a full 7 days, and then on the 8th day he restarts the count. The 7th day doesn't count for the first day of the new counting. You have to wait till the 8th day. Says the Bryce, so the Gemara finishes out the question. If you want to say that when a Nazir Tame accepts upon himself a Naziris, so amai oileloi min aminyan. Why do I care whether the 7th day counts as his first day of the new count? According to Shlokish, he doesn't even have to be a Nazir. He's not really a Nazir, because his acceptance while he's in a basic kvaris is not considered an acceptance of Naziris if he doesn't reconfirm his commitment. So if he doesn't reconfirm his commitment, he's not a Nazir. So how could you compare a Nazir Tahar that became Tame, who has to restart the count without any new commitment, to a Nazir Tame that became a Nazir who was Tame, a person who was a Tame accepted upon himself a Naziris, who is not really a Nazir? Because according to Shlokish, you have to restart, you have to recommit. And as long as you don't recommit, you're not even a Nazir to begin with. So you can't compare one to the other. So now is very important. And here is the machloikis. The machloikis between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish is not the way we understood it. Everybody holds, Amar bar Ravashi. Ravashi explained the new understanding of the machloikis between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish. Everybody holds that if you're in a cemetery and you make a commitment to be a Nazir, mecha, it works. You are an effective Nazir. Nobody agrees that it does take effect. Even though you're in a cemetery, you say you want to be a Nazir, it does take effect. What is the machloikis? Limilki, do you get malchus? If they told you, leave the cemetery, you're a Nazir now, do you get malchus? Rabbi Yochanan says simple. Kivin the chayli, since it took effect, and you're a Nazir, lucky, you do get malchus. Rish Lakish says, loy lucky, you don't get malchus, even though you're standing in a cemetery and everybody's telling you get out, you just accept it upon yourself. A Nazir is not allowed to be in a cemetery. You don't get malchus. But the choyle, it does take effect. You're not allowed to drink wine, you're not allowed to take a haircut, you just don't, the tumah part doesn't take effect. And therefore, unless you leave, you matar yourself, then you become a Torah person. That's when you start the count, and that's when you have then you're dealing with the other isra of a Nazir of not being matami yourself. Esvei Rabbi Yochanan Rish Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan asked the question to Rish Lakish. I have a brayso that says, "Mi shenazavu bebeisa kvaris." A person makes a neder, and that's our Mishnah. Person makes a naziris, and he's in a cemetery. Even if he was there for 30 days, he doesn't count. It doesn't count. It means even if you stayed in the cemetery for 30 days, right? And people said, get out. That doesn't, and people said to you, get out. That doesn't count. You, as long as you stayed into the cemetery, your counting of the Naziris doesn't start. And the Einim Mevit carbon tuma. You don't bring a carbon tuma when you leave the basic kvaris. So if they told you to get out, you don't start bringing a carbon tuma to purify yourself. You just purify yourself with the paraduma waters, and then you start counting tuma. You start counting your Naziris. So with Medayik, carbon tuma hu deloy maisin. You don't bring a carbon tuma. You don't have to bring a carbon tuma. Ha milka lucky. But if they told you to leave the basic kvaris, and you don't leave the basic kvaris, you get malchus, because you have accepted upon yourself to be a nazir, and they're screaming to you, get out of the cemetery. The Mishnah only says that when you leave the cemetery, you don't have to bring a carbon tuma like a nazir who became tameh has to bring a carbon tuma. That you don't have to do. But if you stayed in the cemetery longer than you should have, then you would get malchus. So we see, like Rabbi Yochanan, that it really you have to take it very seriously. That when you become a nazir in a cemetery, you have to leave right away, because otherwise you would get malchus. Not like Rish Lakish. And says the Gemara, Bedinu, really the Mishnah should say the listener ain't like it. Mishnah should say you don't get malchus. In fact, if you don't leave, you don't leave until you actually mitar yourself and start the counting. You won't get malchus, and you don't bring a carbon tuma. Ella, the reason why the Mishnah didn't say that, and Mishum de Koboya, the Mishnah Sefer, because the end of the Mishnah wants to say, Yotza, if you did go out and you waited the 7 days and you became tar, and then the nichnas, and then you went in, so you were a nazir tar, that you just started counting day 1, and then you went into a cemetery, that first day counts as your first day, and therefore you're considered a nazir tar, who may be carbon tumah, and you have to bring a carbon tumah. So since the end of the Mishnah talks about carbon tuma, and it's talking about basically a nazir tar day 1 when he goes into a cemetery. Of course, when he leaves the cemetery and wants to become back a nazir, he has to bring a carbon tuma. So since the end of the Mishnah discusses the carbon, Tana Reisha ain't maybe carbon tuma. So the Reisha, the beginning of the Mishnah, discusses don't bring a carbon tuma. But the Mishnah could also say that in the beginning of the Mishnah, that if you made the acceptance when to be a nazir while you're in the cemetery, not only do you not bring a carbon tuma, but you also will not get malchus. If they told you to leave, you don't get malchus. So Rish Lakish is not questioned from this brisa. Tashma, come in here. So this will be a proof to Rabbi Yochanan. Ein bein tamei shenazir lenazir tahar shenitma. There's no difference between a tamei that made himself a nazir for a person in the base of kvaris, and he decides to become a nazir. There's no difference between that person, the nazir tahar shenitma, to a nazir tahar who became tamei, to a nazir tahar who was accepted upon himself a regular naziris and then walked into basic kvaris. So there's no difference between him and somebody who accepted upon himself to be a nazir while he's in a basic kvaris. Ella, the only difference is, says this brisa, shetamei shenazir, a tamei that accepted upon himself a naziris shvi'i shaloi oiloi min aminyan. He doesn't bring a carbon tuma, and then on the 7th day, after he leaves the basic kvaris, after he leaves the cemetery, so that 7th day should be counted as day 1 of his acceptance of naziris. The nazir tahar shenitma, but a nazir tahar that became tamei. So then he waits also 7 days to be mitar himself from a tmei mace, a sprinkling of the waters. The clock doesn't start on the 7th day. He has to wait till the 8th day, till after he brings the karbanos, and then he could start the clock. So that's the only difference between the two. But when it comes to malchus, if they told him, whether the nazir tar, they warned him, don't go into the base of kavaris, don't go into the cemetery, or they warned the tamei that's in the base of kavaris, that who made himself a nazir, a person in the cemetery says, I want to be a nazir. If they warn him, get out, you're a nazir, and he doesn't listen, they both zev shaman. In both cases, you would get malchus. So we see, not like Rish Lakish, that a tamei that made himself a Nazir, and while he's in the cemetery, he's a Nazir, they told him to get out, you would get Malchus. That seems to be a common halacha that would apply by both Hamesh and Nazir and Nazir Tar Shenitma. Amalei, Rish Lakish Sansi loy. That doesn't mean that way. Litiklachas zeved shaven. It means that you have to take a haircut before you start your Naziris. You see, a Nazir Tahar that became Tameh, not only does he have to wait 7 days, of course, to be mitar himself from being a Tameh mace, on the 8th day, he has to take a haircut and bring karbanas and then start his count. So the same halacha would apply by a Nazir Tameh Shenazir, a person in a cemetery and decided to become a Nazir. When he leaves the cemetery, yes, he doesn't bring a carbon tumah, but he waits the 7 days and then he has to re-haircut himself. He has to take a haircut and then start the counting. Avali in Malchus. So that's what it means. That they both have to, in order to start their count, they have to take a haircut. Zevaz Shavin. Avali in Malchus. My loika v'zani loika. Why doesn't, if regarding to giving Malchus, would you say a Tameh Shenazir would not get Malchus, and a Tar Shenazir would get Malchus, right? You're saying that there is a difference. So Lisnayu, let that be another difference between the two. When you say Ein Bain and you say this is the only difference, one brings a carbon, one doesn't bring a carbon. So then, or the 7th day counts as the first day, and here the 7th day doesn't count. But if also a Tameh Nazir does not get Malchus, and the Nazir Tar does get Malchus, Shnitma gets Malchus if he does it on purpose. So that should be also listed in the Mishnah as another difference between the two. How come the Brisa doesn't list that as a difference? And for the Gemara, B'takante Kamar, our Brisa is talking about how to remedy the situation. When it comes to remedying the situation, that's what we're discussing over here. And so for a Tameh Shenazir, he has to wait the 7th day, and the 7th day he takes a haircut, and that's this first day of the counting. But Nazir Tar, that when he remedies the situation, he has to wait to the 8th day, take a haircut, and bring karbanas. It's not talking about when he's trying to, when we're trying to destroy him in a certain way, when it is something detrimental to him, where he'd be Mechayev Malchus. Yes, that would also be a difference between the two. A Nazir Tar Shenitma, if he did it on purpose, would get Malchus. A Tameh Shenazir would not get Malchus. So we're not speaking on that level, things that are detrimental to him. Again, what does Rish Lakish hold? A Tameh Shenazir, person is in a base of Kvaris that makes a Naziris, right? So if he would not get Malchus if he doesn't leave the basic Kvaris. So here the Brisa says clearly, Misha Haya Tameh v'Nazir. If a person's Tameh and he made himself a Nazir, so then Aser, he's still, that it's a good acceptance. Aser Legaleach, he's not allowed to take a haircut while he's in the cemetery. Belishtis Yain, or drink wine. Bim Gileach, if he took a haircut, Bishos Yain, drank wine. V'nitma l'mesim, and this nitma l'mesim means he stayed in the cemetery longer than he had to. If he did that, he would get Malchus. So what do we see from there? That a Tameh Shenazar, if he doesn't leave the cemetery right away, would get Malchus. So this is against the opinion of Rish Lakish, who says you would not get Malchus. The Yufta of Rish Lakish is refuted. So again, if we go back to our Mishnah and we only understand that the view of Rabbi Yochanan, our Mishnah says somebody makes a Nazir and he's in a basic Kvaris, even if he stood there 30 days and nobody told him to leave, right? Then Ein Oiloi Minaminian doesn't bring a carbon tumah. But if they're telling him to leave, he would also get Malchus. He would get Malchus. He just doesn't bring a carbon tumah, but he would get Malchus. He has to leave right away because he accepted upon himself to be a regular Nazir. And any second that he stays in the basic Kvaris, he would get Malchus. Now the Gemara asks the question: how long do we give him to stay in the base of Kvaris? If he does it on purpose, how long do we give him to automatically get the Malchus? If he doesn't take the shortest way out, Boya Rava asked the question: Nazir, a person became accepted upon himself to be a Nazir, who base of Kvaris, and he's in a cemetery. Maho, what would be the din? Boyo shehia lamalkus oiloi. Does he get malchus right away if he doesn't leave, or does he have to stay a few minutes and then he would get malchus? You see, a nazir tahar. If I tell a nazir tahar, man's tahar, and he's a nazir, and he's about to walk into a cemetery, and I tell him, don't walk into that cemetery. If he takes one step into that cemetery and then walks out, or he walks into the house with the mace. Let's make it easier. He walks into the house that there's a dead body in there. As soon as he takes one step, he doesn't have to stay 2 seconds. He's chayav malchus because I warned him and he went in on purpose. So then he's chayav malchus. But here is a different case because when he accepted upon himself the Naziris, all right, already he was in the basic forest, or he was in the house with the dead person. So it could be in order to be Mechayev Malchus, he has to stay there like a minute or two, and then the Malchus kicks in. So the Gemara says like this: Hey Chidami, what do we take? What do we what's the case over here? A man's, let's say, in a room with a dead body, or on top of in a cemetery on top of a kever. Ilema the Amrileif, they told him, Loy Tinzer, don't become a Nazir. Because if you're going to become a Nazir, that second you're going to get Malchus. Lamali Shahia, why does he have to stay there? As soon as we told him, don't make yourself a Nazir, and he violated that and said, I want to be a Nazir, and he's on top of a grave, so then certainly he should get Malchus. Because Nazir, my tama loy boya Shahia, why is a regular Nazir when I warn him? Why, when he walks into to step on a grave, why doesn't he have to stay 2 seconds on the grave? As soon as he walks over the grave, he gets Malchus, the Kalmasrbe, because I warned him, don't walk over that grave, Mr. Nazir, because if you do, you're going to get Malchus. So he gets Malchus right away. He doesn't even have to stay 2 seconds there. As soon as I warned him and he violated my warning, then he gets Malchus. Hachanami, same thing over here. If a man is on top of a grave and says, and I tell him, don't make yourself a Nazir, because if you do, you get Malchus. Kamasrebe, I warned him, so you don't even have to stay 2 seconds there. You should get the Malchus right away. So what is Rava's question? Go to Yudzayin Amabez. Ella, Rava's question was, a person, Shenichnas B'shida Teva Migdal. He went into the base of Kvaris. Let's say he came into the room where the dead body is, in a box, in an open chest. And therefore, that's considered like he's in a separate room. So I couldn't warn him not to walk into that. When he walked into the room, he was not a Nazir. He was not a Nazir. And then uba chaveroi upara me'olav maziva, and his friend uncovered him and took off the covering of the box of the chest. So when he came into this room, he came in, it was permitted. So he doesn't get warning on going in. So when we warn him to, now you have to leave because you're a Nazir. So the Gemara says, maybe in this case, you don't have to wait. Or since you walked in beheter, so maybe you don't have to wait. Because ki gemir shehir, when do we say that in order to get Malchus, you have to stay there a minute or two, the base of Migdash? If you became violated, if you violated when you're in the base of Migdash, let's say you became Tamei Mace in the base of Migdash, then if you wait 2 minutes and then you delay your leaving, then you get Malchus. But if you don't delay your leaving, you don't get Malchus. Avol abroi loy. Oh, but something that's not in the base of Migdash, you don't have to wait. As soon as you violated your Isser, like by the Nazir, you get the Malchus. Idil Maloishna, or maybe there's no difference. So what is the case of Rava is, a guy came in a box to the base of Kvaras. So he was over a grave in a box. So right now he's not Tamei. And then he said, while he's in the box, he says, I'm going to be a Nazir. And then his friend broke the box. Does he have to wait for 2 minutes in order to be Mechayev Malchus or not? Because his friend broke the box, and when he came into the cemetery, it was beheter. He was permitted to go into the cemetery at that time. And when he made the Naziris was beheter. So therefore, does he have to wait to go out, or right away, as soon as we told him you're a Nazir, Even if he doesn't delay 1 minute, he gets the malchus. Heku, the Gemara remains by a question. New question. Boy Ravashi. Ravashi asked the question. Nazar v'hu beveis hakvaros. Person made a Naziris, and he is in a cemetery. Okay. So when he leaves the cemetery, does he have to take a new haircut again? Normally, a Nazir tahar that became Tameh, right? So then you wait the 7 days. On the 8th day, you take a haircut and you bring karbanos, and then you start the count. Here, when you made a Naziris in the basic Kvaris, we agree that you get that not only does it take effect, but you have to leave right away. And if you don't leave right away, you're going to get malchus. But when you leave right away and matar yourself, do you have to take a whole full haircut in order to start counting again? But you're not bringing a carbon tuma. You're not bringing a carbon. Ki boya teglachas. When do you need to take a haircut? Tar shenitma. If you were a nazitar and then you became tame, the kamitame liniziruse. Since you're metame yanaziris, so the hair that you grew was tame here, and therefore the Torah requires you to bring carbonis and take a haircut. Aval tame shenazir. But if you're a tame that made yourself into a nazir, so from the get-go you were tame as a nazir, no, you don't have to take a haircut when you start the count. Maybe there's no difference. So we're going to do two rayas, and then we'll stop because we'll remain with this question until tomorrow's daf. Toshma, come in here. The Mishnah says if someone makes a naziris and he's in a cemetery, even if he stayed there for 30 days, when he leaves, the maybe carbon. The time that he was in the cemetery doesn't count. He has to wait till he leaves and becomes a tahar, and then he can start counting. And when he leaves, he doesn't have to bring a carbon tuma. So the Gemara wants to make a diak from the Mishnah, carbon tuma hu deloy maisi. The Mishnah only says that when he leaves the cemetery, he doesn't have to bring a carbon tuma. But he would have to take a haircut. So we see from here that when a nazir, a person who's a tameh in a cemetery takes upon himself to be a nazir, when he leaves the cemetery, in order to start counting, he has to take a full haircut. So that's what we're medayik from the Mishnah. The Gemara answers not so. My tam kama. The Mishnah is saying reasonings by saying that you don't have to bring a carbon tuma. Automatically, the Mishnah is saying you don't have to take a haircut either. So that's which the Mishnah didn't have to speak out. Ma tam made a carbon tuma. The Mishnah is telling you what's the reason you're not required to bring a carbon tuma. Mushum deloy boya galucha, because you're not required to take a haircut. So that's the reason why you don't bring a carbon tuma. So maybe the Mishnah also agrees that when he leaves the cemetery and was matar himself, he does not have to bring a carbon tuma. So the Gemara says one more proof. Tashma, come in here. Ein bein tamesh and nazir. There's no difference. This is the third time I think we're having this on the page. Ein bein tamesh and nazir. There's no difference between a tameh that became a nazir. L'nazir tar shenitma, for a nazir tar that became tameh. There's no difference between these two scenarios. El tameh shenazir, if a person was in a cemetery and accepted upon himself to be a nazir, shvi shaloi oiloi min aminyan. The only difference is that on the 7th day could be counted as the first day of your counting. The nazir tar shenitma, but if you're a nazir tar that became tameh, and therefore you have to start the clock, it doesn't start on day 7 when they sprinkle you the paraduma mortars. It actually have to wait till day 8 to bring the carbonis. You have to wait to count till the day number 8. So that's the difference, because in day number 8 you have to bring a carbon. That's the only difference between the two. So we want to say, my love, doesn't the Raisa mean to say both have to take a haircut, just like another tar shenitma. On the day 8, when he brings the carbonis, has to take a haircut to restart the counting. So the same halacha should apply by a tameh shenazer, and he's matar himself on the 7th day. That day 1, he should take a haircut before we can start counting his naziris. So that seems to be an answer to Ravashi's question. Answers the Gemara, Loi, not so. Hala malchus zebes as shavin. When it comes to malchus, they both are equal. In other words, if a tameh doesn't leave the cemetery or takes a haircut, he's a real full-fledged nazir. If he drinks wine, he would get malchus. So that is the Malchus, they would be both equal. In other words, once they matar themselves and they become tar, if they go back into the cemetery, a Nazir tar would get Malchus, and a Tamesh Nazir would also get Malchus. Aval teglachas, but to take a haircut to start the Naziris, what do you say about that? That a Nazir tar shenitma would take a haircut, and a Tamesh Nazir would not take a haircut. Lis nayu, let it say that's the reason. That's a good difference between the two. Why doesn't the Brisa say that is also a difference? The Brisa seems to say ein bain. There's the only difference is whether you start the count on the 7th day or the 8th day. But if you're telling me that one takes a haircut, Tamesh Nazir does not have to take a new haircut, and a Nazir Tarish Nitmod would have to take a new haircut, why doesn't it say that? Answers the Gemara, it does say that. When by saying the 7th day counts for a Tamesh Nazir, you're basically saying because the 7th day counts. Why does the 7th day count as day 1? Because he doesn't have to bring a carbon tumah. Why doesn't he have to bring a carbon tumah? Because he doesn't have to take a haircut. So that, in effect, is saying that it's implied there that a Tamesh Nazir does not have to take a haircut, whereas a Nazir Tar Shenitma would have to take a haircut. But this is unresolved question because you could go either way. So basically, we're leaving off today's daf with the Bayer Ravasi. Ravashi asked the question: if a man made a Naziris and he's a basic kvaris, so of course you have to wait the 7th day, 7 days to purify yourself from Tmei Meis in order to start counting to be a Nazir. The question is whether you have to take a haircut again to start counting the Naziris, because a Nazir Tar Shenitma, after bringing the karbanis, or he takes a haircut, or before bringing the karbanis, he takes a haircut and then brings karbanis and starts the counting again. So would you say the same idea would apply when somebody was a Nazir Tamesh became himself a Nazir? Would he also have to take a haircut? So this Rashi's question is the discussion we have, and we'll continue on Daf Yud Ches.